Good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Arhoon. I'm facilitator for this session. Jane O'Sullivan is our speaker. She's from the University of Queensland. She's a researcher, and she's going to speak on planetary overload, population and consumption, fertility control and ethical challenges. And then we have certain other activities for us to do after presentation.
Right, thanks very much, Robert. Let's go to this concept of the Anthropocene, which David King already introduced so well for us. And the main point here is that this explosion in humanity on Earth in the last 200 years is an extremely short period of time in the geological history of this planet. And the rate at which we're changing systems is phenomenally fast, and far faster than the biological adaptation mechanisms that have evolved to cope with change. So if the Earth was 46 years old, then humans evolved 4 hours ago, and the Industrial Revolution happened 1 minute ago. And in that time, we've destroyed 50% of the world's forests, and a lot more beside, as you know. So in this scenario, hockey sticks is a term that's used for these sorts of graphs where things were cruising along with very little change, and then quite quickly they get to very steep changes in a short period of time. And we're seeing it on so many parameters around, certainly around the biosphere, in terms of fish stocks, deforestation, loss of species, and in terms of climate change, the accumulation of greenhouse gases, extreme weather events, etc. And we all know that this is a health issue. This is a major public health issue, and the Lancet put out a report last year, along with the Rockefeller Foundation, focusing on human health in the context of the Anthropocene epoch. What does that mean? And this is a part of their infographic, so they were really framing human health as being dependent on the health of the biosphere. We need planetary health for human health. And we're not the only ones. There are other species, and we do have to consider other species in our ethical framing of this issue. In the end, you know, do we really have the right to convert all of the planet's resources for human needs? And we are going through what's called the sixth great extinction. Species are being lost between 100 and 1,000 times faster than at any time in the past, apart from the other extinction events. And this is a particularly fast one. David also introduced the idea of planetary boundaries, and this is a really good framing of the issue because it makes it very explicit that there's no single criterion for human impact. It's not all about climate change. Climate change is part of the aggregate set of impacts that humanity is having on the planet, and that contravening any one of these boundaries can be a threat to the integrity of the whole system. So here we come to, sorry.
With the previous slide, sorry, but this is a quick question. Is every of these 9 aspects thought to be equally important as the others? Or is it just these other 9 major things which really are
these are
determining the planets?
One group of researchers' way of grouping impacts, I guess. So it's probably not entirely inclusive. There might be others that don't fit into these categories. But in terms of which is more important, the concept of unfungibility comes in. That the important one is the one that's most limiting now. But it's not important across all contexts. And I'm an agricultural scientist, and in agricultural science, we learn about this in terms of Liebig's law of the minimum. So plants, for instance, need about 13 elemental nutrients, and they have to have all of them. And they might only need a tiny amount of copper, but they will die if they don't have that copper. So you could say nitrogen is more important, but it's not important to a plant that's dying of copper deficiency.
Maybe it's similar if you look at the human body, I guess, as doctors.
Indeed.
You know,
So that's the same. So that was Liebig's context, but the same applies for humans. You can die of iodine deficiency while having plenty of protein.
Looking at that graph, and I can understand the biodiversity loss because we're losing lots of climate change loss. I don't understand why the nitrogen cycle is so way out of kilter.
Well, that's quite a big story that's not really in the public sphere, but since inventing the Haber-Bosch method for industrial production of nitrogen fertiliser, humanity has been managing to feed its population by producing far more biologically active nitrogen than the biosphere ever had before. And of that fertiliser, only a small percent of it, maybe about 15-20%, goes into the plant that you're going to eat. Then maybe half of that actually goes into the food. The rest ends up in the biosphere somewhere. A lot of it is demineralised and goes back into the atmosphere as non-active dinitrogen, but there's a big load of nitrogen that doesn't necessarily kill things straight away, but it changes the balance of ecosystems in profound ways. So, on to the IPAT equation, which David mentioned, Peter mentioned, sorry. And this was a formula introduced by Paul Ehrlich and David Holguin back in about 1972. So I equals P times A times T, and the P stands for population, the A stands for affluence, and the T stands for technology. So it's not really, our impact isn't proportional to the quality of life that we have. It's proportional to the way we achieve that quality of life. That's the technology part. But then it's also multiplied by the number of people who are living like that. So when we say, well, how does population stack up against things like changing our diet or using less transport or switching to renewable energy, all of those things, they're all the things that add up to our impact. So there are lots of things that add up to impact. But there are fairly few factors that multiply. So that's the difference. Population is a multiplier. It acts across everything else. So every, kilowatt hour of renewable energy that we produce only has a certain impact on our aggregate demand on power, depending on how many people have to use that. So if we have twice the population in Australia by 2070, we have to build twice as much renewable energy infrastructure as we would otherwise have to. So it's a multiplier across all areas. Now the question then arises in these circles, but what's the most important factor? And that's really, a factor is a factor. It's going to cut across everything. But is the appropriate framing, what can we actually change? What is useful to be focusing on in terms of achieving a different future than a laissez-faire approach? And that's where my emphasis is on including population in those environmental and development discussions, and that's where it's been largely isolated over the last couple of decades. It's become very unfashionable to include population. I've been to a lot of IPCC I mean, UNFCCC climate change meetings, and it's very much under the radar there. You know, nobody's willing to talk about population growth in relation to climate change, even if you want to talk about it in terms of its impact on people's vulnerability and their adaptation to climate change. So the first fallacy that we constantly get is what I call is the inclusion is exclusive fallacy. If you raise population, people say, well, it's not all about population, it's about consumption. So, and this is exactly what the Greens do in their population policy. Now, they've got a whole suite of policies, and all of their other policies deal with the way we live. And this one policy that's to do with population is focused on telling us that actually we should be talking about the way we live. Right? And like where we put people, and the fact that we haven't got a right to, you know, stop anybody moving around the planet. So there are two parts of that statement, and in the first one it's saying environmental impacts are not determined by population numbers alone. Well, nobody's saying it they are. That's a straw man argument, but we get it all the time. So we need to recognise it as a straw man whenever it comes up. And then the answer is not, but also by the way we live. The answer is, but by the way we live. They've just cut it out, right? Now it might be semantic, but it's actually powerful rhetoric. The second fallacy is that if it's unethical or impractical to control population, then population isn't a problem. So we don't look at population as a contributor to the things that we're modelling. And this comes up in the IPCC's socio-economic models for climate change. In fact, in those socio-economic models, the emissions outcome is determined largely by the population trajectory of each of those scenarios. But all of the difference in the discussion of those scenarios is attributed to economic and governance measures. You won't find a mention of the difference in population scenario in those different emissions outcomes. It's not in the model. And the third fallacy, sorry, yeah, Peter.
In the UNFCCC framework, they call it the Kaya identity, which is named after a Japanese economist. And it's quite funny because when he basically took the affluence bit and broke that down into some other factors, and the technology bit and broke that down into some other factors, and he had population in there. When they brought it into the UNFCCC, they took the population out, and their modelling uses the same function without population in it.
I actually should have included a slide on the Kaya identity because it's what I call self-affirming factorisation. You can make anything appear to be proportional to something else, and the Kaya identity makes it look like emissions are proportional to GDP, basically, by adding a calibrating factor that makes it proportional. You know, and you just don't account for how the calibrating factor is changing over time. So anyway, we'll move on. And the last one is that mentioning population is scapegoating the poor for the impacts of the rich. And this is where we come up, you know, with the idea that if we talk about population, it's somehow turning our backs on or being an apologist for the consumption patterns in rich countries. What I hope to come out of this presentation is to emphasise that the poor are the victims of this population growth. It is the poor who are suffering most from unchecked population growth. And addressing their population growth is very pro-poor. I'll just skip over that one. So the idea is, can we live sustainably and with dignity? Can we achieve a level of human development for everyone on the planet without destroying the planet? And this is a chart from the WWF Living Planet report. And on the vertical axis is ecological footprint as determined by the Global Footprint Network. So it's an aggregate of various types of impacts of consumption on the environment. And on the horizontal axis, you probably are familiar with the Human Development Index, which is an aggregate of income, income, education and longevity, more or less. And you can see that there is quite a correlation there, that it apparently takes a certain amount of wealth to increase the Human Development Index, but you can have quite a high Human Development Index with a relatively low impact. The problem is that over time, the horizontal dotted line is the bar below which we have to be in order to not destroy the planet. And that bar's moving down. So we're being chased into this bottom right-hand corner by population growth, because that bar is the one planet divided by the number of people. The bigger the population, the further it's moving down. How do we know if we're in overshoot? And this chart is really just to emphasise the point that there is no big bang. It doesn't come up in lights when we transgress the carrying capacity of the planet. That happens later, when we've drawn down on all the capital and we've reached the bottom of the barrel. That's when things go pear-shaped. And it's very hard to come back from that point. As you know, if you kind of max out all your credit cards, you've been living unsustainably for some time, but you've created a very difficult position to turn around. So,
Sorry, one more question.
yes.
With the previous slide again, so that point, carrying capacity, and that says no big bang, this is what at the moment always happens in around, what was it, August, September, that we each year...
Yes, that's the Global Footprint Network again, saying that, well, in fact, because we're using more than 1.5 planets worth of renewable biocapacity per year, then we've transgressed the planet's carrying capacity by fairly early in August these days. That's exactly making that point.
That is the thing, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And each year we go back to zero and start again.
With a smaller capital asset base, particularly in the atmosphere. So, have you all heard of the limits to growth modelling exercise that the Club of Rome published back in 1972? So it was an exercise in computer modelling back in the days when the computer that was probably less powerful than your mobile phone occupied a warehouse at MIT, and they were writing some pretty simple code to run these models, but they had the idea that we could use this new computer crunching power to put together trajectories for projecting the demands of humanity on all sorts of different parameters. And in their standard run, the business as usual projection, they anticipated that in the first half of this century, things would go very pear-shaped. We would go on, with nice growth in food per capita and services and health and longevity through into about now. And then a shortage of resources or an accumulation of pollution would begin to limit that development and start turning things around. You'll notice that it takes then a few decades of worsening conditions of living for humanity before the population actually starts to decline. But what it takes to bring population down, just to give you an idea of scale, it requires something in the order of 100 million premature deaths per year, year on year, for decades. I think the Ebola outbreak killed 11,000. So we're talking about 100 times the last Ebola outbreak every year is what that declining population trajectory looks like. So as William said, it's not a matter of whether our population will stabilise, it's a matter of how. And when we say, well, we'd like to control population and control birth rates, it's because we think it's preferable to that. Our Graham Turner from the CSIRO at that time took a look at the limits to growth modelling 40 years on and said, well, how have we actually tracked? And he found that we had tracked pretty much dead on that standard run. So the Club of Rome had also done some other runs, which meant that if we'd taken appropriate steps at the time, back in 1970, we'd be in a much more sustainable position now. But it appears that they've been pretty much dead on with the trajectory for where we got to on the standard run, but we can't yet prove that they're right about the tipping points and things going downhill. It's a salient point. So we talked a little bit about ecological footprint and the fact that it's a single metric that combines a number of different types of impact, and the fact that we're now using 1.5 planets. We think, well, how is that possible? And in fact, what they're doing is saying that we're burning fossil fuels, and if that was to be renewable, fossil fuels are millions of years of stored photosynthesis. They're plants and animals that have grown and been gathered up and buried, and we're burning them now. So if we were to actually burn what the planet can grow each year, we'd need 1.5 planets. I'm not sure why that's okay. So if we look at the time course for our aggregate human footprint, it has paralleled the human population. Now, in the same time, we've managed to increase the biocapacity of the planet. That is, we're getting more crops, more animals and things per hectare of land. We're using resources more efficiently. We've made a lot of technology improvements, but we're only increasing it a little bit, and the population has gone up a lot. So on a per capita basis, actually our per capita impact globally hasn't changed much over the last 4 decades. And it hasn't changed much in rich countries, which is the top line. Now, rich countries are certainly having a bigger impact per person than the poor countries, but it's not increasing proportional to our GDP. The big thing that is changing is that green line, which is the biocapacity per person. So that's our rising biocapacity being divided by a more steeply rising population, meaning that the per capita line is going down. And it's that drop in the per capita biocapacity that has put us into overshoot, not the rise in impact per person. And we see this very dramatically with arable land, for instance, and we have managed to grow twice as much food per hectare as we did 50 years ago, and we can feed twice as many people per hectare of cropping land. But we have twice as many people per hectare of cropping land, and so we're running to stand still, and we are losing a lot of resilience in the process. We don't have the flexibility to do things differently in a lot of ways because we have to produce at that level. And we can't guarantee that we can pull that rabbit out of the hat again. We can't guarantee that we can double food production per hectare again over the next 50 years. That's quite a big ask.
That was for Australia, no?
That's global.
Global.
And a consequence of that is a very big increase in the number of countries and the proportion of people who are dependent on food trade internationally. And there are quite a few countries who import all of their grain imports. They don't grow any domestically. And a quarter of the world's nations import more than half of their grain. That's a very vulnerable position in an unstable global economic climate. And we know that shifts in the global price of those food commodities can trigger conflict, which is symptomatic that people are really stressed to be able to afford to buy food. And this study was done a number of years ago, really showing that there's a threshold in the food price index above which conflicts start to appear. And the worrying thing is not that you get these peaks where there's been an El Nino or something and the food price goes up, but that the baseline is increasing. And so pretty soon the baseline will be at that level where conflicts are triggered. Rwanda was one situation where it was anticipated that conflict was on the way because of the density of people trying to subsist from a very small area of land. And this is a quote from Lester Brown, who's a champion of this issue and a warrior of the Green Revolution back in the 60s, where he was instrumental in delivering the technology to India that staved off famines at that time. The world is only one poor harvest away from chaos. And Lloyd's, the insurance underwriting company, did a study last year, or commissioned a study last year, of what would happen if there was a deep El Nino that caused a shortage of food and a food price spike, and the repercussions globally to economic stability and to asset risks is quite scary. So we're very close to that edge. Population growth is moving the goalposts, particularly in terms of food security. Yeah, Helen.
When you talk about green revolution, you're actually talking about herbicides and fertilisers, aren't you?
We're talking mainly about improved varieties of grains, of wheat in the case of India, and later rice, which were supported with irrigation systems and fertilisers, and pesticides to a lesser extent. But
my understanding was that in the end didn't actually increase it, that over time that's actually reduced the amount of food producible.
Well, and I would strongly dispute that. I think it would be absolutely impossible to feed the people we currently have on the planet without those technologies today. And whether or not we would prefer not to have to use them, we've removed that choice by having so many people. This was a report put out last year by the Population Institute that emphasises that link between population pressure and environmental degradation and political instability, and framing population as a challenge multiplier. And it really becomes very stark when they look at the countries that are still have very high fertility and are growing very fast, like doubling in 20, 25 years. The strain that they're already under, and that yet they're going to grow by, South Sudan by 236% by middle century. Afghanistan with, virtually no spare water. probably going to grow at least 80% by mid-century, unless more is done. Burundi, I don't know how they're holding it together, but it's at the top of the list for on the Global Hunger Index. Tiny country, tiny amounts of land per family, and still has a fertility rate around 6. So another report by the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on Population Development, emphasising the importance of population stability for sustainable development in the context of Sustainable Development Goals. And I took this from that report, and the idea that the Sahel, which is a very environmentally vulnerable and degrading area, might have 1.6 billion people by 2100, up from just over 300 million today. And the picture of this family with its 8 children, the caption says that the Inusa family own about 2 hectares of land in the dry sub-Saharan Sahel region. Their property yields about 2 tonnes of millet, which is enough food for the family to live for 7 months. Only a decade ago, before 6 of those 8 children were born, that family had a sustainable livelihood. The population growth across the whole of sub-Saharan Africa is reducing agricultural capacity per capita about 5 times faster than climate change. And yet you'll read articles every day about the impact of climate change on the food security of those regions. Population growth is reducing their food security far faster. And then we know that there are a whole range of barriers to changing that, and one is child marriage, and one that we're involved a little bit in promoting the end of child marriage at the moment. It's a vicious cycle. It means that the earlier girls are married, the less education they get, the more pregnancies they have, the poorer the family is, and the poorer the family is, the more likely it is that they're going to try and offload their daughters early. So it goes around in a cycle. It's very sad. And so there's a lot of education and community work that needs to be done to bring that to an end. Now, I want to move quickly through some data on the global population. And these are the points that I want to make, is that we're adding around 80 million people to the planet annually, and that's 1 billion every 12 years, and that growth has not yet slowed. It's roughly linear growth over the last 40 years. A lot of people have said, well, we're past peak child, it's just demographic momentum filling up the age cohorts that's causing this growth. Well, actually, no. The number of births per year has been increasing over the last 15 or 16 years. So we are not past peak child, we've reverted to a growing birth rate. And while people are taking the UN's projections as, a statement of fact, fertility rates are not dropping as fast as those projections anticipate, which means population is likely to be larger than those projections anticipate. In the meantime, no country on earth is at risk of population collapse due to birth dearth. You will hear a lot more in the mainstream media about the risk of population decline than the risk of overpopulation. And it's a complete beat up.
But you have to wonder why.
Indeed. We probably don't have time to get into that. So is the population growth stopping all by itself? Most people believe that it is. Well, I can't see the inflection point coming down on that curve. It's a straight line since about 1970. In 1968, we had the highest ever relative growth rate of population. The global population grew at 2.1% that year. In 2010, it only grew at 1.2% per annum. So the growth rate's almost halved. You know, hooray, it must be stopping. But this is the nature of linear growth. You get the same increment every year, but you calculate the growth rate by dividing that increment by the total you've achieved. So if you've doubled the population, you've halved the growth rate. Linear growth has no automatic peak, so we're not on that trajectory yet. These are the latest UN population projections, and the median projection anticipates 11.2 billion and still climbing in 2100. And we need to remember that these are projections, they're not modelling of what's possible. They don't take any account at all of resource limits. So if we can't feed those people, they won't be here. The chance of having 1.6 billion people living in the Sahel, I think, is extremely slim. It's a question of what else will happen. Now, what to focus on in this chart is the 3 blue lines. So the dashed blue line at the bottom is what the UN projected as recently as 2004. And in 2010, it added a whole billion to the expectation in 2100. And then last year, it's added over another billion to that expectation. So should we expect that they've now got it right? Should we be comfortable about the idea that we only have to provide for 11 billion people on the planet? How far can it go before we get there? When the 2012 projection came out, John Wilmoth, who's the head of the population division at the UN, explained that the reason that it had been revised upward is that the fertility that was actually happening wasn't falling as fast as they'd anticipated. And yet their modelling still is on the same basis, using the same anticipation of fertility fall as before. So the median variant projection is thus an expression of what should be possible. It could require additional substantial efforts to make it possible, and the emphasis is his, not mine. That's not the message that most people get when they're told about the UN's population projections. So how have we been tracking since that projection that he gave? And in terms of short periods of time, it's easier to look at the increment of growth rather than the aggregate growth. And this is the annual increment since 1990 through the 90s. The increment was coming down, and that's when people started to believe, yes, we are heading for a population peak, we've got this under control. Around 2000, it turned around and started going up again. And there's a few reasons for that, but neglect was a big one. Now, the UN anticipates that it's going to go down again pretty promptly, because they're building in expectations of fertility decline in all those high fertility countries. The pink line is not the UN's high projection, it's actually a constant fertility projection. So if you just said all the countries in the world are going to keep the same fertility rate that they've got now. If we actually stayed on that line till the end of the century, we'd have 28 billion people on the planet, which of course is impossible. But the black dots are what the Population Reference Bureau, which is another agency that collects data from every country on the planet and puts out an annual population data sheet. It's what they have reported has actually happened in those years. So we're not on the UN's median projection, and fertility is not falling globally. It's falling in places, but the the places where it's not falling are becoming a bigger share of the global population. And it's also rising in a lot of places. A lot of the low fertility countries are deliberately boosting fertility. So globally, we haven't got a falling fertility rate at the moment. One of the reasons is that funding for family planning became rather unfashionable in the mid-90s, and this was following the last UN Global Conference on Population and Development in Cairo in 1994, where the whole issue of population growth and family planning was reframed, and the emphasis was placed on individual rights, reproductive health, and sexual and reproductive health and rights, SRHR. A big mouthful that kind of doesn't cut across the rhetoric of global agenda very well. But the result of that, despite all countries committing to providing universal access to sexual and reproductive health and rights, was a dramatic decline in support for family planning programs. Now, that's not the only reason. Another reason is the US, what's called the gag rule, where the US Congress decided to prevent US aid going to any organisation that might even refer somebody for an abortion, which made it very difficult to have anything to do with family planning if you wanted to get US aid to do any health work at all. So the family planning industry shrank quite dramatically in that time, and whereas the difference in those blue lines on the global projection were not all that big, the difference in projected population for those high fertility countries is massive. So this chart shows in the red where the UN was expecting Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda and Zimbabwe to be by 2050, and the green is where they expected them to be by 2050 in 2008. 10 years later, they've revised upwards by that much. The arrows I added to bring it up to the 2012 projection, and I haven't yet revised it up to the 2015 projection, which is above that. This is the impact on those countries of 15 years worth of neglect of family planning. It's a very high price to pay. So, if we think about over that period of time, we're told that the best way to bring down fertility is education of girls, economic development, and reducing mortality of infants. Over that period of time in which those revisions were made, all of those parameters were advanced considerably under the Millennium Development Goals. There was a lot of success in infant mortality, in girls' education, and in economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa. This happened despite that. So, to me, that's indicating that family planning had a lot to do with it. It's not fashionable to say that family planning programs drive fertility decline. Hardly any studies even look at whether or not family planning programs are present when they're analysing what has caused fertility decline. They just leave it out of the equation. But if you look at the countries we know that implemented, how are we going for time, by the way?
I think we might need to speed up a bit.
Yeah. Okay. All the countries that implemented strong family planning programs, fertility came down rapidly. And as you can see, the ones that started later, they've come down even faster because we've got better technology and better communication technology and higher levels of public education. So, these days we've got LARCs, the long-acting reversible contraceptions, that are so much more effective. We know that works. And I looked at contrasting strong family planning program countries with weak family planners to see if there was a relationship between wealth and fertility decline. And what I found was the wealth diverged after the fertility declined. So the difference in wealth is the middle chart, and on the right is plotting the fertility rate as a function of wealth. So the story that wealth drives fertility decline should mean a convex curve, as in you would increase in wealth and then fertility would start to come down. What we found was a steeply concave curve where fertility dropped before wealth progressed, and it got down generally below 3 before there was real traction on economic development. And so I've done this for 5 different pairs of countries in different regions, and all of them showed the same steeply concave pattern, none of them really taking it off economically until fertility is below 3. And that shocked me, you know. I just discovered this, and it seems to be the best kept secret in global development that I know of. It's ridiculous. I wanted to point out in the bottom left here, that's China and India, and the one-child policy was introduced in 1979. The job was done by then. The one-child policy did not cause China's fertility decline. That was done under a voluntary program rolled out around 1970 into every village, with lots of, you know, positive messaging about the benefits of small families. And the Chinese chose to do that voluntarily. The one-child policy was probably a negative. There's nothing that makes people want things more than being told they can't have them. So when people say, oh, we can't control fertility because, you know, we don't want to impose a one-child policy, it's not necessary, and it wasn't even effective. We're not talking about coercion anywhere. I was going to show, has anyone seen videos from Hans Rosling? Yeah, I was going to show a video clip. I think we might skip over it just for time, but he's kind of making that argument that economic development drives fertility decline, but his own data show those little dots tracking each country. They're not going that way, they're going that way. And you've got to watch the dots to see it. But we
wonder whether you could go back to that previous slide and talk about some of the factors that were important in that the fertility rates declining firstly. What factors?
Okay, well, family planning programs are horses for courses. There's not a kind of cookie cutter that fits every context. So it's got to be culturally appropriate. It's got to address the barriers that are present in the country at the time, whether it's child marriage or religious objections to contraception, or women not having autonomy to seek their own health care, or it has to be tailored to the country. But also what I wanted to get on later is that it works much better if it's integrated across other development approaches. Under the sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda, it's been very much siloed into the health portfolio and cut off from the development portfolio and the environment portfolio. So when you unsilo it, people can join dots themselves. You know, it doesn't take much to get people to join the dots, and I'm hoping we've got time to look at a video that talks about that. So having gone from that data, and the paper was rejected because the reviewers said you hadn't shown direction of causation. I said, okay, well, what does it take to look at direction of causation? So this is the change in fertility over a 5-year period for all countries in all 5-year periods since the UN data started in 1960 against GDP per capita. No trend. Wealth has not been necessary for high fertility decline. Has wealth depended on fertility? Hell yeah, it has. It hasn't. Low fertility doesn't guarantee enrichment, but high fertility makes it virtually impossible. And the only outliers there are the odd oil state that managed to have high growth for a very short period of time because they're selling a whole lot of oil. But otherwise, that high population growth is such a burden on development that it makes it impossible to get ahead. So then I looked at grouping all countries just on the simple criteria of the rate of fertility decline, maximum 2-decade period. And of these three groups, only the fast decliners have declined fast enough that they've actually got a declining slope in their population heading towards a peak. So even the purple line, which is the moderate family planning countries, are still adding more people per year than the last year. Because even though their fertility's come down, the number of mothers is going up faster. The red line is those that have done very little, are still very high fertility countries. They've tripled their population in that same time, and they've got another doubling in the pipeline if they act fast now and do what the green countries did. The real shocker is how that looks in terms of GDP. And if people are going to tell you that population growth is not important for development, then sorting countries on the basis of their fertility decline should not separate them on their GDP course. This is a massive difference in amount of development achieved by those countries that are sorted just on how much they decline in their fertility. And when you plot, as I did before, the total fertility rate against the GDP per capita, by grouping those countries together, they're all following the same path. It doesn't matter whether you decline fast or slow. Your rate of economic development will be determined by how far you've reduced fertility. I mean, that's so glaringly stark to me, and yet this, I'm finding it very hard to get this published. Nobody wants to believe that this is true. Anyway, so then I said, well, okay, how much could we take off the peak population if all the remaining high fertility countries were to embrace family planning and merely achieve the average that group one, the green group, did before? And we saw that average is pretty conservative because the technologies meant that we can actually do things faster. If they achieved the average and started tomorrow, we could almost achieve the UN's low projection. If they continue as usual, not the UN's assumption of immediately resuming fertility decline, we're likely to have 13.5 billion by the end of the century, which I think will be very hard pushed to feed. So here we come into how can we actually translate that on the ground, and there's different levels of intervention, and the global framing of the issue is very powerful. The fact that the UN isn't talking about direct action to reduce fertility and population growth as a problem is a big dampener on individual countries doing it. But when it comes to what small projects and grassroots development can do, the model of integrated development using the population health and environment framework has been very successful. And I'm just going to skip through these because...
what I'm thinking is you can't get your work published, it sounds sensible. What you're saying sounds sensible to me. And it reminds me just exactly what we're talking about here with climate change, where we've got all these sensible things that we should be doing, and yet we can't get them to happen. And I guess, my reaction to David King's talk was depression, the same to yours. It's like, God, we're just losing every battle on every front, and there's all these invisible forces that stop us from doing sensible things.
Pretty much. And we had touched on it before, we have to really think about who's pulling the strings here. It's not without some logic and reason, it's just not in the public interest. Now, I was going to show a 10-minute video, but I think we better move on to our group workshop, and we might show it at the end.
A couple of minutes though, picking out a few projects,
Yes.
because we do want to give some hope how.
Yes.
Yeah,
even though there are
okay.
Examples.
Well, these were 3 examples from Ethiopia, and there's the PHE Ethiopia Consortium is like a peak body that enables grassroots development organisations, and particularly those with an environmental focus, to adopt the PHE model. And so they become PHE partners, and by integrating the family planning with livelihood, women's empowerment, school programs, and getting the different development workers who are interacting with that community to talk to each other about how it fits together. They've actually had much faster progress on all of the fronts than when those interventions are done separately. So they've had higher uptake of energy saving stoves and clean water and modern latrines, and the use of contraception and less child marriage in that particular instance. This one involved a lot of rural development and erosion control, and that was enhanced along with the contraception acceptance. And again, with environmental controls and, people reporting that they understand that, I will not have more children because I want to help these children that I have to properly grow. It's very logical when you give people a reason to do it. And the video that I want to show, which we might just put on in lunchtime perhaps, is from one of the projects that I've had a little bit to do with. But Chase Africa is promoted by another colleague, and that's just such a lovely image that I only got last week of the camel train in northern Kenya. It's a very recent picture. That's a consignment of contraceptions going to remote northern Kenya. So it's quite lovely.
Okay, I'm going to just close this session now. Thank you, Jane, for stimulating.
Well, thank you for participating.